Welcome to For Palestine, the podcast dedicated to amplifying voices that advocate for justice, freedom, and the end of the Israeli occupation of Palestinian lands. Today, we are joined by Rifka Brown, a journalist and reporter known for her compelling journalism on pro-Palestinian activism and her contributions to publications such as The Independent, Financial Times, and Haaretz. She brings a unique perspective to the discussion of culture, politics, and grassroots movements. So, Rifka, welcome, and how are you?
I'm really well. It's fantastic to be here.
Actually,
This conference is just an amazing medley of different people, and I've met some, I've met people from Indonesia, Malaysia, and hundreds of people from Palestine. It's fantastic. I could never have done this in London.
And actually, it's nice to having you in this interview with our podcast, by the way. By the way, your name came from Hebrew and Arabic culture.
Yeah,
you know that.
I know. It's something I only realized recently. Like, I always thought my name was just a Hebrew name, the Rebecca in Hebrew. But actually, I discovered because of Muhammad al-Qad's book about his grandmother, which is called Rifka, that my name is also Arabic. I was like, why is Muhammad al-Qad's grandma called Rifka? Does she have a Hebrew name? But no, it means friendship, right? Close friendship.
Yeah. Okay. Rifka, you are British and Jewish, and you used to be a Zionist in the past. So tell us about this story.
Yeah. I mean, it's complicated, and it's hard sort of admitting that to people, especially here. But yes, I was raised in a Orthodox Jewish family in North London, and universally, the experience of most religious Jews in the diaspora is a Zionist experience. And so, like most religious Jews in the UK, I had a Zionist upbringing. I was sent to a Jewish primary school where we celebrated the foundation of the State of Israel and Israeli holidays like Yom HaAtzmaut, where we sang the Israeli national anthem and had Israeli flags. We learnt Hebrew and had lovely Israeli teachers in our school, but we were never taught about Palestine. And that continued. I went to a youth movement, a Zionist youth movement when I was a teenager. It's a rite of passage for many Jewish people in the UK to go to Israel when they're 16 for a month. And you tour Israel and obviously nowhere in Palestine, learning about Israeli history, Israeli geography, visiting important religious sites, like Jerusalem, obviously. And then you're sort of, I suppose, left to your own devices. And I think that's the point where Zionism started to fall apart for me. I think, when I went to university, I started reading a lot of post-colonial literature and African diaspora literature. And I think just the experience of sort of broadening my worldview and understanding sort of Jewish history as part of a broader history of racism, of persecution, and sort of seeing the Jewish experience as somehow not exceptional made Zionism make less sense for me. So when I was 19, I visited Namibia. I lived there for 3 months. And learning about the Herero and Nama genocide, I think, put into context the Holocaust in a different way. I think a lot of the Jewish desire for a nation state and the kind of history of the foundation of Israel comes from a Jewish belief that what happened to us was unique and uniquely bad, and therefore Jewish people unlike other genocided people, deserve a nation state. And that's the only way we can be safe. But, I suppose I kind of saw the history of other genocides and realized that wasn't necessarily the logical conclusion.
Okay.
And I think I also learned about, colonial history and the history of apartheid. Namibia was also part of South African apartheid. It was, there was an apartheid in Namibia until the 1990s. And I think I sort of began to apply that framework to Israel and sort of see that the kind of colonial history that I was learning about in relationship to Europe's colonization of Africa was also applicable to Israel, I think. And my sort of relationship became complicated, I think, by that knowledge. But I continued to visit Israel. I continued to have family in Israel. Obviously, I still do to this day. And so the process of de-radicalization, you might say, from Zionism happened over time. So I think I just gradually started to feel more and more alienated from Zionism. And then in 2015, I went on a tour of the West Bank with a Jewish organization called Yachad, which means together in Hebrew. But, it's interesting because Yachad is not an anti-Zionist organization. It's actually a liberal Zionist organization that wants Jews to be anti-occupation, but not anti-Zionist. But through visiting the West Bank and seeing, the sort of daily humiliation that Palestinians were subjected to. We met a family in a town near Hebron who believed that their son had been killed by Israelis whilst he was in hospital. He had been arrested, but he was injured in a clash with the IDF in the West Bank, and he never came home. And I remember everyone in the group sort of questioning the truth of it. But I think even the possibility that was true just really sickened me. And I think, realizing the extent and the kind of cruelty of the occupation, the house raids and the checkpoints and the kind of denial of your basic freedoms, just really, really disgusted me. And I think, from there I started identifying probably as a non-Zionist. And then eventually, as things kind of progressively got worse, and I think during the kind of period in 2015 to 2019 when Jeremy Corbyn was leader of the Labour Party, and there were a huge amount of kind of attacks on him, partly as a result of his position on Palestine, I began identifying more and more as an anti-Zionist. And now, definitely since the genocide, I don't actually think there's any other moral position to take. So, I think that's kind of where I am now. But in terms of, my relationship to Zionism and how that's affected my relationship to my Zionist family and my Israeli family, it's complicated. It's really complicated. There are people in my family who send me emails that are full of hate, and there are cousins that have messaged my siblings to say the most horrible things, and school friends of my siblings who've found my number and doxed me and texted me abuse. And so it's been really hostile.
So you had a lot of challenges with your family and the closest friends.
But I've tried to sort of maintain relationships where I can, but honestly it's difficult. And my Israeli family, I haven't spoken to them really since just after the 7th of October, when I did check in with them to check they were okay. But since then I haven't been able to speak to them. I found it really difficult. And I haven't figured out how to find a way forward with them.
So we could say that there wasn't a turning point that make you anti-Zionism. Otherwise, it was a slowly process.
It was, and I think, it's difficult to have a break with Zionism completely as a Jewish person who's been raised in a Zionist environment, because to break with Zionism is also to risk losing a community. And so you're sort of for me, it took a long time to accept that I would lose friendships and relationships as a result of being anti-Zionist. And, you know, I think there are braver people than me who would have just rejected it, you know, in a day. But for me, it took a long time. And I'm not proud of that. I was balancing my relationships against my values. But, you know, being here and meeting people who have family members who, you know, dozens of family members who've been murdered in Gaza, I do feel like a sense of guilt that it took me so long to stand up against this. But, you know, it's an internal conflict that, took a long time to resolve.
And now, as a journalist, you have written a lot about the pro-Palestinian protests and solidarity campaigns, actually.
Yeah, I have. Yeah.
So how did you see these campaigns and the impact of these campaigns in order to support Palestinian cause, especially in Britain, for sure?
Yeah. So the Palestine movement in Britain has been really supercharged in the past few years. It's you know, there has been a Palestine movement in the UK for decades, and particularly since the sort of 1980s when the Palestine Solidarity Campaign was established in the UK. And, you know, the Palestine Solidarity Campaign is great. It campaigns for legal changes. It campaigns successfully for the parliament to recognize the state of Palestine in the 2010s. And you know, there was a gradual progress of the Palestine movement from the 1980s to the 2020s. But really in the last few years, it's been kind of accelerated, particularly by the protest group, the direct action group, Palestine Action. And so Palestine Action, they take incredibly disruptive actions, usually targeting the factories of Israeli weapons companies, mostly Elbit Systems, which is the biggest state-owned Israeli weapons company, which has subsidiaries in the UK. And so they have been smashing up sort of factories and equipment. They've been occupying factories. They've been, you know, targeting the sort of businesses that enable the arms company, the banks that bank with the company, the insurance companies that insure the company. So they've been doing amazing work at saying, we can't just campaign for legal change. We also have to stop the manufacturing of Israeli weapons.
Yeah.
So they're doing something quite sort of radical, but you need both. And actually, this year, since the genocide began 15 months ago now, there has been an enormous protest movement organized mostly by the Palestine Solidarity Campaign that's brought out literally hundreds of thousands of people onto the streets of London. I think one of the protests was nicknamed the Million Man March, which I don't think there were quite 1 million people there, but there could have been, 3, 4, maybe 500,000. So it's been incredibly powerful. And I think that the power of it has been demonstrated by the backlash. So actually yesterday, during the conference on the 18th of January, there was a march in London, and for the first time, the police stopped the march from going where it wanted to go. And they claimed this is because it was disrupting synagogues nearby. So obviously we see the weaponization of anti-Semitism in the protest movement. But the fact that the police are cracking down so heavily is a sign that they're threatened, and is a sign that they know how much the protest movement has it politicized hundreds of thousands of people. The vast majority of British people wanted a ceasefire. Now we hopefully have one, although we see that Israel is still bombing at this moment. And so I do think the massive street protests have communicated something to the general public that has shifted public opinion, but politicians will never admit that, obviously.
And by the way, in one of your recent articles, you highlighted the tensions between the Palestinian Solidarity Campaign and the Metropolitan Police over protest restrictions. So Could you elaborate more on how these restrictions have impacted the movement?
Yes.
Okay.
So every single Palestine march in London has been subject to some police restrictions. So every time the PSC, the Palestine Solidarity Campaign, negotiates with the police to agree a route and a time and a place. And every time the police say, maybe avoid this building because there's going to be a government official there, or maybe start a tiny bit later because there's going to be another event. And so they always sort of have a bit of a push and pull. And so far they've managed that successfully. The marches go ahead. But this last march yesterday, they couldn't agree because the PSC wanted to start at the BBC. And the BBC is obviously very important at the moment in the Palestine movement because there has been a huge amount of scrutiny of its pro-Israel bias.
Okay.
And, you know, I have written reports about this. I wrote a report about one very senior BBC News executive called Jonathan Munro, who wrote to his colleagues saying the ICJ ruling is not as important as you think it is. It's, you know, plausible genocide. They're not saying that. It's not as significant as you think, which is quite shocking for a BBC executive to downplay the seriousness of the ICJ ruling, which was incredibly historic and could be the only time that we hear them say the word genocide for years, because the ICJ process can take, you know, I think in the case of Bosnia, it took 14 years or something to finally decide.
Yeah.
So it was very important. But there was also a BBC investigation by a journalist called Owen Jones, who wrote 9,000 words about the sort of control that the BBC has over Israel-related content. And so they wanted to start at the BBC and march to the parliament, but the police said no. And the reason they gave was synagogue disruption. But actually, you know, the nearby synagogue services don't start anywhere near the start time of the march, and they finish long before the march would have come to the BBC. So it was always a very kind of dishonest excuse, but it was a very good example of how Jewish people are used to crush the Palestine movement. Okay. You know, because hundreds of Jews, something like 800.
Good point, by the way.
Yeah, 800 Jews. I think more now, probably over 900, maybe even 1,000 Jews, signed a letter to the Metropolitan Police saying, we participate in the Palestine movement and we are not threatened by the march. In fact, you know, we think that this march enables Jewish life to flourish because it encourages, you know, peaceful coexistence. And so even though hundreds of Jewish people said, we want the march to happen, we are the march, the police still said no. And actually, you know, if you look at the congregations that are near to the BBC who are complaining to the police about the march, the rabbi of one of the nearby synagogues is fanatically pro-Israel. Fanatically pro-Israel. His sermons are really pro-Israel. You know, he talks about how we need to take up arms against our enemies in the media and on the battlefield, you know, encouraging people to go to Israel to fight, that sounds like to me. And you wonder whether actually the complaints that people make are really because of synagogue disruption or because they're politically opposed to the march. Because, you know, there are Jewish people who are pro-Palestine. There are hundreds, thousands of Jewish people that I've marched with on the Palestine marches. But, you know, the people that the Metropolitan Police listen to are pro-Israel. And that's I think indicative of the dynamic of UK politics, which is the police or the government really wants the marches to end. It's nothing to do with Jews, actually. They don't actually care about Jewish people, but they use Jewish people, selective Jewish people who are pro-Israel, as a reason to crush the march, basically. Okay. So it's not really the fault of the pro-Israel Jews, but the Metropolitan Police and the government who use these Jewish people to say, this march can't go ahead.
Okay. About the supporting of Jewish groups to the solidarity movements in UK, you have reported about that, by the way. But how did you see that this could be too much effective in order to support the Palestinian narrative in Europe, especially?
Do you mean how do I think that the Jewish pro-Palestine movement can be effective?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I think it's complicated. In a way, Jewish people being vocally part of the Palestine movement, it's sort of playing the identity politics at its own game. Okay. You know, the right, the pro-Israel movement, the government, the police use Jewish people and Jewish groups use their identity to say Jews need Israel and Jews support Israel. And so by having Jewish people be very visible in the Palestine movement, you sort of break down this very essentialist notion of Jewish life as uniformly pro-Israel, and therefore you complicate the idea that Jewish people Jewish people think one thing about Palestine, and I think that's really important. It kind of because it's such a common narrative amongst the kind of governments of the West, Germany, the UK, France, that like Jewish people want the marches to stop. I think you need to sort of counter that with Jewish people and say Jewish people actually don't say that. Mm-hmm. And I think the aim of the Jewish pro-Palestine movement isn't to sort of say, actually, Jews are pro-Palestine. It's to say Jews are not one thing. Mm-hmm. You know, some Jews are pro-Israel, some Jews are pro-Palestine. And I think that's really important for the Palestine movement, because then the Palestine movement can say, we don't oppose Jewish people in Israel. We oppose Zionists in Israel. And I think that's really essential. And we've had a lot of speakers here very kind of carefully clarifying that when they talk about Zionists, they're not using it as like a metaphor for Jews. They're not using it as like a synonym for Jews. They're using it very, very deliberately. And they don't mean anti-Zionist Jews or non-Zionist Jews. Okay. And so I think that, you know, Jewish people being part of the Palestine movement is, I mean, it's really important for Jewish life, I believe, because I think and I hope that it sort of pushes the Jewish community to sort of question its relationship to Israel. But I also think it's very significant for the Palestine movement because it can therefore kind of show that Jewish people are not its target, and actually Jewish people are allies, and Jewish people coexist with Palestinians within the Palestine movement and in Palestine, you know, 70, 80 years ago. And that the problem isn't Jews. The problem is Zionism and people who subscribe to it.
And the ethnic cleansing.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay, since 7th October and this genocide starting, you said that you couldn't be Zionist anymore. But far away from your job as a journalist, how was your feeling? How did you live your life during this genocide?
Yeah. It's been difficult. And I think, you know, after the 7th of October, my relationships with Jewish friends of mine became very strained because I struggled to respond to the 7th of October in a way that kind of incorporated both my my joy at seeing people break out of a concentration camp, because in the beginning, that is what it felt like in the very beginning of the 7th of October, before we understood maybe some of the extent of it. Obviously, not everything that happened on the 7th of October was good. And obviously, I don't condone the killing of civilians. I don't celebrate the killing of civilians. But I do celebrate people breaking down fences, people targeting military bases. So I felt on the 7th of October this kind of initial joy followed by a kind of shock and confusion and fear, because I knew what was going to happen was going to be extreme. I didn't realize it would be genocide. I think this year of the genocide has been confusing because so much and difficult, because so much of my my work has been focused on the genocide. So when something happens, whether that's a bombing campaign or something in the UK around the policing of Palestine solidarity, my first thought is, should I be writing about this? And what should I write? What should I do? What should I kind of, how should I respond professionally? And so my emotional response, I think, has been suppressed, and it's come out in sort of in bursts. So when I recently I was a judge for the DIG Awards. It's a Digital Investigative Journalism Awards in Modena. And because I was a judge, I had to watch something like 15 hours of documentaries. And 50%, maybe 70% of the documentaries were about Gaza and the genocide. And during that time, I had this kind of opportunity that I hadn't had for a year to really engage emotionally with the genocide, because I was just watching films and responding just purely as a kind of as a person. Yeah. And I cried. I was crying for days and days. And I was depressed. I found it difficult to get out of bed. I found it difficult to work. And I think I had locked this emotion inside me. And then in the autumn, it just kind of all came out. And yeah, after that, I think I've found it kind of easier to sort of live my life, I think, because I was just holding something inside. But no, it's again, being here is challenging, because you want to it's a professional environment, but a professional environment where a significant proportion of people are grieving, are in a constant state of grief and shock and fear. And so it's really, you absorb so much of it, and it's difficult to know how to respond to it. What do you say to someone who's lost 50 family members in Gaza? I'm sorry. I'm sorry for your loss. They might lose more people. It's not, I'm sorry for the loss. I'm sorry for your future loss. I'm sorry for your ongoing loss and your constant loss. So yeah, and it's even as I talk, I find it difficult to know how to respond. But yeah.
As a British and Jewish, did you feel somehow responsibility on what's happening in Palestine?
Yeah, I do. And I mean, yeah, I think this is why I found it difficult to know how to contact my Israeli family, because I know that there are members of my family who have served they've all served in the IDF because they have mandatory conscription, but, have been reservists in the recent past. But I'm not sure if they currently are have served, because most of my cousins are slightly older. But I don't want to know. And I find it difficult, because what if I find out something that I can't, scrub out of my memory, and it stays with me. And yeah, I do have this sense of responsibility, but I think the responsibility I feel is also quite diffuse. I feel responsible when I see the Jewish Chronicle on my parents' dinner table. I feel responsible when I hear, family friends or people in my Jewish community talking about Israel, or when I go to a synagogue and I see a huge poster saying "Bring home the hostages" and nothing about Gaza. I feel responsible because I feel like I'm part of a community that's enabling this to happen, and I'm not constantly challenging every single person that I meet. So I do have the sense of responsibility, and it's difficult to actually know what to do, because my choice is don't engage at all with my Jewish community that's pro-Israel, which is a significant proportion of it, or exist in a constant state of conflict.
Okay.
Or sort of have this compromise where you're kind of keeping the peace somehow, but it's like a victor's peace. It's like a kind of, it's this really like uncomfortable peace. So yeah, I've struggled to navigate that, and as a result do carry a lot of guilt.
Okay. And on the other hand, after 7th October, you started to understand the narrative of resistance people and liberation movements in Palestine.
Yeah. After the 7th of October, did you
Yeah.
say? Yeah. Yeah, I have. And I think, I have kind of learned a huge amount, particularly about Hamas and like the kind of history of it and the nature of it, and its relationship to other movements and political parties, Fatah, and I think like it's sort of, I think what reading about all of this has shown me is like that Hamas is like the creation not just of Palestinian people but also of Israel. Israel wanted, and Netanyahu wanted nothing more than for Hamas to be the sole power or the main power in Gaza, because a militant, religious political resistance is much easier to smear as terrorists and to sort of other. And I think there's something really, really important to note in that Israel throughout its history, whether that's the bombing campaigns of the Zionist movement in Iran in the early days of Israel's foundation, to the constant creation of fear amongst Jewish people in the diaspora, and the convincing of Jewish people that anti-Semitism is a kind of constant, imminent, universal threat. Obviously anti-Semitism is a threat, but the way that Israel portrays it and the way that Israel's allies portray it is completely disproportionate, and kind of inflammatory and designed to create fear. All the way through to Israel's encouraging of Hamas in Gaza is deliberately designed to create a situation where military action is inevitable and where genocide is justifiable, and so I think I think Hamas is a much more complicated political entity than we understand in the UK. In the UK, Hamas is a proscribed terror organization. So expressing support for Hamas in any form, even if you talk about supporting Hamas's construction of a hospital, is a crime. So you can't express support for Hamas. And I think as a result, British people tend to see Hamas as one entity, which is solely this kind of like guerrilla, like terrorist force, when actually it's like a very complicated governing party in Gaza, which has a military wing, but also lots of civil, functions. So I think, I've realized over the past 15 months how British society is deliberately kept in ignorance about what Hamas is. I've spoken to journalists here who've interviewed Hamas officials, and the idea of doing that in the UK is unthinkable. I can't think. Perhaps there may have been one interview that Channel 4 did with a Hamas official. I'm not even sure that that's true. But but the idea of engaging with Hamas and its ideology, its kind of its own military aims in the same way that we do with Israel is totally unthinkable in British society.
Okay, let's talk about the broader cultural shifts. In your piece on Emma Watson's pro-Palestinian statement, you highlight cultural shift in how celebrities approach this issue.
Yeah.
So, do you think public figures are becoming more emboldened, to speak out, and what impact does this have on the movement?
It's a really good question. I often feel quite frustrated by the lack of sort of bravery amongst celebrities. But, you have to remember that a celebrity has cultivated their fame through the careful navigation, usually of a film industry that is incredibly pro-Israel. So it's like inevitable to some extent that celebrities would be silent on this. And I really felt it actually recently. I went to a screening of a film called Blitz, which is about the Second World War and the German bombing of London.
Okay.
And I think I was just really shocked to see that, in fact, it was the First World War, scratch that. But yeah, I think I was just really shocked to see after the film that nobody spoke about Palestine. This was a film about a bombing campaign in the UK and the fear that British people felt, that Londoners felt in this bombing campaign during a fascist sort of onslaught. And no mention was made of Gaza at all, even though Steve McQueen, the director of the film, if you're watching this, Steve, please say something, is supposed to be quite a political artist. He made art about Grenfell, which is a famous fire in a council building in the UK. He's he's seen as a kind of Black British sort of quite political filmmaker, but no mention. All from Saoirse Ronan, who's Irish, who speaks a lot about, kind of Ireland and its complicated relationship to Britain and obviously the colonial history of Ireland. And I'm like, mate, what are you doing? There's just a massive elephant in the room here and you're just not addressing it. But I do take some encouragement from the kind of, ceasefire movement amongst celebrities. You do see, celebrities on red carpets wearing their pins and talking about Gaza, and you have people even like Angelina Jolie, who's incredibly vocal about Palestine, or musicians. We recently had Novara Media had an event with Massive Attack, who are a big kind of British band, that are incredibly vocal about Palestine. And so there are, I think, a significant number of celebrities that do speak out on this. I do think there is an impact, and the kind of PACB, the political and cultural boycott of Israel, does do amazing work in coordinating statements from celebrities on the genocide. And I do think people see, you see your favorite actor, you see Mark Rylance, you've just watched him on Wolf Hall, the BBC adaptation of the novel, and I think that does move people. It inevitably does shift public opinion, because unfortunately we do have a culture in Britain that is that does kind of heroize celebrities. But I think that there is a price to pay, and that we see celebrities being punished for their solidarity with Israel. Whether that's the actor whose name I've suddenly forgotten, who was cut from the Scream horror movie sequel for her statement about Palestine, which was I think she really just called for a ceasefire. It was that bland, all the way through to people kind of not getting awards. There's some talk about about Angelina Jolie not being nominated for many awards this season because of her kind of solidarity with Palestine. Obviously, it's not possible to prove this sort of thing, but I do think that there's a kind of a hard limit to how much celebrities will say about Palestine, because I think that they know that there is a price to pay, and particularly younger actors early in their careers probably think, I've got a lot to lose. I've got decades left of my career, and why would I want to sort of squander it now? But I think what's definitely happening is solidarity with Palestine is gradually becoming normalized, and particularly, like, I think as evidence of the genocide becomes more and more horrific. And when we see Western journalists going into Gaza and calculating the kind of damage and documenting the genocide more thoroughly, which hopefully they will, I think we will see the kind of cost of being pro-Palestine decrease for celebrities, which I think, hopefully will sway public opinion, because they in turn normalize certain positions amongst the general public.
What about the role of social media in order to amplify the authentic Palestinian voices in your point of view?
Yeah. Do you mean the use of social, like how Palestinians use social media to amplify their voices? I mean, it's amazing. It's been amazing. And actually, one of the things that I find frustrating, and I've talked about at this conference, is when the BBC says it's difficult to report on Gaza because we're not allowed into Gaza. We don't have access to Gaza. And I'm like, there are hundreds of journalists in Gaza, and many of them would be more than happy to work with the BBC, who have hundreds of years of experience between them. But somehow the fact that Palestinian journalists are on the ground and live in Gaza is seen as kind of somehow compromising their work rather than actually like validating it. When I want to write about, or when I want to publish a piece on Germany, for example, sometimes I'll write it myself, but more often I'll commission somebody who's on the ground, because I think they know their stuff. They know Germany much better than I do. But the reverse is somehow true with Gaza. With Gaza, Palestinian journalists are seen as less credible than Western journalists, even though they know the territory much better. But when it comes to social media, I mean, I think that social media, the Palestinians' use of social media during this genocide has, I think, been I would suggest actually the main source of information about the genocide, and the main factor that has swayed people despite the chokehold that kind of Israel has, and pro-Israel actors like governments have on Western media. So people often ask, how is it that the Telegraph, the Times, even the Guardian can be so sympathetic to Israel, or can republish Israeli military propaganda, and yet British people are pro-ceasefire? How is that the case? And the answer is social media. Social media has punctured and broken through the kind of legacy media narrative so effectively during this genocide, I think. And I think that's because people know that they're being lied to, and people can see when a narrative is partial. And I think that like the amount of evidence coming from Palestinian journalists in Gaza has just overwhelmed, I think, social media. And even, Instagram, which is owned by Meta, which now has a rule that you can't use the term Zionist in certain contexts, and which shadow bans Palestinian accounts, and which, blocks and bans Palestinian accounts. Even despite the efforts of social media companies, which are in turn often owned by pro-Israel actors, the kind of tidal wave of content has been like irrepressible, I think. And I think it's like, even you see now with like TikTok being banned in the US, which is, I think, partly to do with the radicalizing effect of pro-Palestine content on TikTok. Even despite that, there are already Palestinians finding ways around that, and Americans moving to different platforms in order to get information. So I think like social media has an incredible way of circumnavigating the kind of silence and the kind of censorship, which I think has kind of made an enormous difference to this genocide.
As we move into 2025, what do you see as the key priorities for the Palestinian solidarity movement? What are the major challenges, for example, and the opportunities ahead?
Yeah, I think it's a really great question, and I think it's really important that the political movements on the left generally, think in that kind of proactive way rather than just reacting. We've been on the back foot with the genocide for almost a year and a half, and I do think that kind of like proactive mindset is like really important. I think this year is going to be about ensuring that the ceasefire is maintained, obviously, but also that the ceasefire isn't the end. We don't just need to end the genocide. We need to end the occupation. We need to end the blockade of Gaza. We need to end the ethno-state that is Israel and create a one state in which all people of all faiths can live together as equals. We need to see the ceasefire not as an end point, but as a waypoint and as a kind of stop on the journey, I think. And I think, what's difficult is that a lot of the kind of more moderate and centrist campaigns around the genocide have been calling for a ceasefire, and that's it. That's the kind of ceasefire now is the acceptable sort of position. And I think now that we hopefully have a ceasefire, a lot of liberals, a lot of centrists are going to struggle to really know what to do next. And I think the left and the pro-Palestine movement needs to guide those people and show them that this is a process of decolonization and of constructing a Palestinian or kind of rebuilding a Palestinian nation that can live equally alongside Jews on the land. So I think, it's about kind of the next step, which I think is kind of rebuilding Gaza, obviously, but also ending the occupation. I worry that as the genocide has gone on, people forget about the West Bank, and that Israel will turn its attention there once the ceasefire kind of beds in, and that actually we have a very urgent and dangerous situation in the West Bank that we need to address. So I think rebuild Gaza, end the blockade, deconstruct the occupation, and ensure that Israel doesn't use this moment to kind of effectively annex the West Bank, which I think is a real risk this year. Israel, like all dying kind of colonial projects, is at its most dangerous point, I think, because there's no limit to what it will do. And like it's completely, like the brakes are off effectively. And especially with Donald Trump being inaugurated tomorrow, I think we really, it's easy to think Trump helped to negotiate a ceasefire and therefore Trump is supportive of the Palestinian movement. Absolutely not the case. Donald Trump does not want a Gaza genocide because he's bankrolling it. He's paying for it. But the settlements, the annexation of the West Bank, I mean, that he can get for free. So I think Donald Trump will enable Netanyahu or whoever replaces him to continue to colonize and to potentially annex the West Bank in a way that he won't necessarily allow them to pursue a war in Gaza or a genocide in Gaza. So I think we do really need to watch the West Bank this year.
Okay. Really, Rifka Brown, thank you so much.
Oh, thank you, Ezra. It's been a wonderful hour. I've really enjoyed our conversation.